So I'm ready to talk all things books. I wanted to do a sit down video chatting about what books I've read recently. I know in the Spring Equinox video that I made, I did mention that I was reading Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies, and I know a lot of you wanted to hear my thoughts on that particular book. If you've not seen my Spring Equinox video, I will link it here so that you can go and check it out if you wish. And so yeah, in general, I thought I would talk a little bit about that book, but then the other books that I've read recently as well. So I actually didn't set myself a numerical reading goal this year. I actually rarely do, only because I never usually stick to it, or I just forget about it. And so it's never been something that I've got into doing, but I do try and set some sort of reading intention. And this year my reading intention was to make sure I was reading more non-Austen books. I reread a lot of Jane Austen if I'm prepping for the podcast or if I'm writing articles. And last year in particular was really heavy on rereading Jane Austen. I like to reread the books if I am focusing on a specific character or a specific topic, just so I can really hone in on the subject. But I read very little non-Jane Austen books last year, and so something that I was really wanting to do this year is to read things that have been on my to-be read list for a while now, and just other books that take my fancy. And I'm already off to a good start. So January was a little bit slow because I was doing a lot of podcast prep, but February on I have been doing quite well. I've been reading quite a few books. I've been enjoying it. It's been lovely to get back into just, reading for pleasure and not necessarily for a purpose. So I thought I would talk about the books that I've been enjoying recently. I'm not going to give anything a star rating. I always really struggle to do that. Like when Goodreads asks me, I'm always just like, I don't know. I feel like I've not read, well, in my mind, I feel like I've not read enough books to have a good enough scale to know where to place things. And so, yeah, I'm always terrible at giving a star rating. So I'm not going to do that today. But yeah, let's get into it. Okay, I may look down occasionally just because I have notes, because else I'll forget what I actually have read. Even if I enjoyed it, I'll just forget. So if you see me looking down, that's what I'm looking at. Okay, so the first book that I actually picked up was Cackle by Rachel Harrison. This is a book that I had on my to-be read from around Halloween time, because I know it was on a lot of people's spooky season list, and I saw a lot of good things about it. People saying, it's a really nice, cozy read, and so I was looking forward to picking it up, and I actually read this one on my Kindle. I do agree with a lot of the other reviews that I've seen on this, that this is just like a cozy comfort read. I definitely understand why a lot of people pick this up in the autumn time, because it really does have a lot of autumn vibes, like small town feels, pumpkins, cozy coffee dates, that kind of thing. But obviously I didn't read it in autumn. But it was pretty easy going. It was an easy read. It didn't take me that long to get through. And it was, in that sense, it did kind of grip me. I was intrigued to see what happened. I would say that Annie, who's the main character, I didn't particularly like her. I found her super irritating, and I don't know if that's me just being very unsympathetic, but she spent a lot of the time pining about the ex-boyfriend who dumped her, and I was a little bit like, can we just move on and just like embrace this new life? Like, she goes away and starts a new life in a new town. She gets a new job. She's got a lovely little flat of her own, so she has like all the potential to really thrive. But she really is hung up on the ex-boyfriend. And after a while, that just kind of got a bit tedious to me. I was just like, Annie, come on girl, we've got to shake things up. But Sophie, on the other hand, is a really great character, or at least I really loved her at the start of the book. She's really interesting. She's really independent, self-sufficient. She is very talented. She can make her own clothes. She's a really good cook. The town folk are a bit fearful of her, which at the start you're a little bit like, why? Is it because she's like evil or something? Like, you're worried that she is malevolent and she's been like causing havoc on the town. So you're not quite sure, or you don't know if something specific happened, which was like really terrible. But you kind of get drawn into her and Annie's friendship, because they honestly have such a great friendship. They spend time together baking and having wine and cheese nights and reading together, and honestly, the whole thing's a total vibe. And Sophie makes Annie like new clothes, like beautiful clothes. And yeah, I feel like their friendship is probably the best thing about the whole book. I would say if you're frightened of spiders, this probably isn't the best book for you, because there's a lot of spiders, and Sophie's familiar is actually a spider, and so he's around a lot. I think in terms of like portrayal of witchcraft, it tried to suggest that the book was kind of busting misconceptions about witchcraft, while I felt it was simultaneously showcasing misconceptions about witchcraft. But I feel like it's just personal opinion, and also I think that that's beneficial because of the type of book that it is. You know, I feel like sometimes you need to go down the more like hocus pocus route for it to be just kind of fun, light-hearted. So the author definitely did do that. I was a little bit disappointed that the author kind of betrays some of Sophie's initial characteristics that I really liked a bit later in the book. That was a little bit annoying, and I thought the climax of the book was a little bit over dramatic. But other than that, you know, I really recommend just giving this one a read. At the end of the day, it is a book about witchcraft, friendship, and empowerment. You know, it's quite a good book about how you can empower yourself to be happy on your own. Like, you don't necessarily need to be with somebody to be fulfilled in life. There are other paths. And so in that stance, I really think it's a good celebration of that. It's a really good celebration of female friendships, which I like. It's a nice portrayal of female adult friendships. And yeah, that's my thoughts on Cackle. So the next book that I read was actually A Billion Years by Mike Rinder. This was actually on my list for a while, but I was waiting for it to come out on Audible. I'd seen Mike Rinder on the Aftermath show with Leah Remini and also on their podcast. And so I thought that he would release a self-read audiobook, but it never seemed to come on Audible. And so eventually I was just like, never mind, I'll just get it on Kindle instead. I did find this book interesting. I actually already knew a lot about Scientology prior to reading this book because I'd watched the Louis Theroux film, and I'd watched all 3 seasons of the Aftermath show by Leah Remini, and I've also consumed like a lot of other content around Scientology, around L. Ron Hubbard, around Scientology doctrine, their policies, all of that kind of thing. So there was nothing in this book that shocked me, I would say, because I already knew a lot of what goes on, or what did go on, what continues to go on within this organisation. But it was interesting to see Mike's journey from a young age and how he got into such a high profile position in the church, and then eventually obviously his escape and what that meant for him after, like, him kind of rebuilding his life. I've always really liked him as a person. Like, when I've seen him on other programs or shows, or being interviewed by people, he always comes across pretty authentic and genuine and kind, and he's definitely suffered a lot from his life in the church. And we're talking a long time, you know, he didn't escape till I think he was 53. That's a long time to be in an organisation and, you know, suffering, because a lot of the treatment of the people who are in the church is pretty horrendous, particularly to staff members, which Mike was. I would say if you don't know a lot about Scientology already, reading this, you might have a lot of gaps, and there's probably a lot of references to certain people that you might not get, or you might not recognize the significance. So a lot of the people that are mentioned in the book I already knew about from obviously all the other content that I'd read or heard or watched, and so that really helped for me to understand Mike's position in the church, and how he was in such a high profile position and what that meant, and just why it was so shocking that there was so much corruption at the top, and how so many people who were just average practitioners had no idea what was going on, or still have no idea what's going on. But because I already knew quite a lot, it was easier for me to follow the timeline of the book. I would say at times it did feel a little monotonous because we were kind of going through his whole life, and it was a little patchy at certain points because, well, obviously because it was like 50 plus years that he was trying to recall, if not longer, because obviously by the time he wrote the book it was you know, I do have maybe 10 years on, and so that's a long time to try and recall all of the memories and everything. So I do get why it's patchy. In certain areas, you know, we'd skip maybe a few years, or there'd only be a short section on certain points, and then we'd move on. And I don't know whether that's just average for memoirs or autobiographies or biographies. It's not a genre I pick up very often, and so I don't really have anything to gauge it against. So maybe that is kind of the norm, obviously, because it's people either recounting memories or their own story, or somebody writing someone else's story. But yeah, you know, in general, I did really enjoy it. I always think it's really commendable when people write books like this, because it's actually getting this information out there that really helps people escape from cults or toxic organizations, because a lot of the time they're totally unaware. But the more information that's out in the public, the harder it is to keep people in the dark. And so obviously people writing their own experiences, and people in high profile positions like Mike was, I think, is super important. And so in that sense, I always think it's good to promote and read this kind of book and support these people, because obviously they're fighting for a greater purpose. They're trying to help other people, a lot of them that are actually like their friends and family members. And so yeah, in that sense, you know, it's a good read. I think it's good to support people like Mike. And yeah, that was my thoughts on that particular book. Do you like my mug, by the way? I feel like it's total spring vibes. This is one of my Emma Bridgewater mugs. I actually got them for my 21st birthday, I think, from my parents. So I've had them for like 4 or 5 years now. And yeah, it's so cute. It's got little ducklings on. What I love about these mugs is they always put kind of writing on the inside of like what's on the mug. And so yeah, this one says ducklings, and it's really cute, and I just think it's very fitting for spring. So the next book that I picked up was another non-fiction book, but it was historical non-fiction, and that was Malcolm Gaskell's book, The Ruin of All Witches. So this was also on my to be read list from October time, I believe. And this is one that I saw about quite a lot and was really intrigued to read it, because a lot of people assume, because of the way that kind of media often portrays the witch trials, or the kind of histories that were told about the witch trials, that they actually were to do with witches, when in actual fact there was probably very few magical practitioners who were actually killed during the witch trials, but there were hundreds and thousands, if not millions, of people killed just for maybe not conforming in a certain way towards the Christian faith, for not getting on with their neighbours, if their children died suspiciously, which in like the 1600s, you know, children did die quite regularly. There wasn't cures for illnesses like there are now, and infant deaths were pretty common at the time. So a lot of people at the time were just very anxious and paranoid, and they kind of focused all of that energy towards people who were considered witches, or those who were still practicing pagan traditions, which, because of the rise of Christianity, and particularly the Puritan branch of Christianity, paganism was really frowned upon and feared and seen as kind of a antichrist faith in a sense. But what I like particularly about Gaskell's book is you follow a small town, and so you get to know like all the people in the community, and you get to see their paranoia develop and how they become focused on one particular couple in their family, and how all of their paranoia kind of spirals to a point where they accuse this couple of witchcraft. But also I think it's just sad to see that this really did rip communities apart, and because people were so distrusting of their neighbours and their friends. Nothing too like significant necessarily happens, because you are just following a small town, so this isn't necessarily an account of any trials that were really well known in the Salem witch trials, like court cases, I suppose. It doesn't feel kind of like groundbreaking, but what is interesting to just see how this paranoia grows in this small community, and then it makes you really understand why it grew so fast across the whole of the West, and why people were just really taken up by this, why people were so fearful. And yeah, I mean, I just think it's good to learn about this thing if you're interested in history, and particularly history of the 1600s, if you're interested in the witch trials. I think this is a great book to read. I think it was super interesting. Something that absolutely, oh my goodness, blew my mind with this book is it was a couple of chapters before the end, if not the last chapter potentially. And one of the people from the town, because a lot of people from this town kind of dispersed after everything came to a forefront, and one of the people moves, I actually think it was the priest or the vicar in this particular town, and he moves back to England to basically start a new life, and he moved to the village that I grew up in. Like, of all the places in the UK he could have moved to, honestly blew my mind that he moved to the village that I grew up in. And initially when I first read it, I was like, oh my gosh, and on top of that, he probably moved into my house, because I grew up in what was the coach house to the rectory, so the vicarage or whatever you want to call it, basically where the their vicar lives. I lived in like a converted coach house, so I was like, oh my gosh, he literally moved into my house. But then when I looked at the dates, I actually think that that particular rectory, including the coach house, was built maybe about 10 years later, maybe a little bit longer. And so it was unlikely he was in my particular house. But yeah, it was honestly so crazy. I don't know if that's ever happened to somebody when you're like reading a historical book and then suddenly you hear about somewhere that's like connected to you or close by to you and you're just like, oh my gosh, that's so mental. But yeah, even though my family don't live there now, I might go and do some investigating and just try and like learn a bit more about that time period. But yeah, that's all my thoughts on that particular book. Okay, so the next book that I read was Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies. This is by Heather Fawcett. I believe I mispronounced her second name in my Spring Equinox video, so apologies for that. But I loved this book so much. I think this is probably my favourite one in the whole list. So this book was like totally enchanting and whimsical, and honestly, it was such a pleasure to read. So it basically follows Emily's adventure as she goes to this, and what I'm guessing is an Icelandic region, to investigate Holderfolk, or the Hidden Ones, which is a type of fae that you find in Iceland, or supposedly finds in Iceland. And she is kind of a little bit hopeless when she gets there. One, because she isn't very good at people, and so she already starts to rub the townfolk the wrong way. But also because it's like super heavy snow at this location, and she just doesn't know how to manage. Like, she's come from Cambridge, where she was a really well respected lecturer there, and she had a warm fire and a nice office, and life was super cozy and chill. And then she's ended up in this like really remote village, and it's freezing cold, the snow is super deep, and yeah, she just doesn't know what's going on really. But she's like super keen to start investigating the fae and learning about the stories that the villagers have, but they don't really trust her. And then Wendell shows up, and he is like the complete opposite to Emily. He is super charismatic, and everybody is drawn to him because he's really handsome and playful, and he's such a fun character. Honestly, Wendell is probably my favourite, even though he can get like a little bit irritating at times, because you're like, oh my gosh, Wendell, stop being like so snobby. He is like so endearing. And basically they work together to try and find out more about the fae, and they go on all these like mini adventures together, and yeah, it's just super magical, and their relationship is so funny. They have so much angst between the two of them, but you can like kind of see that maybe something's gonna happen there, and you're kind of trying to figure out what Wendell's secret is at the same time, trying to work out if he's there for good intentions or bad intentions. You really just don't know for a lot of the book. You're just like, I don't know what he's playing at. But what I really loved about this book is you can tell that Heather did a lot of research, or just had a lot of prior knowledge about fae of different areas and different countries, because a lot of people have different traditions. They have different folk tales and different stories about different fae, and that does differ between where you are, even though there may be some crossover. Obviously in England we have our own folklore and stories of fae folk, particularly on a lot of household fae such as brownies, but obviously Ireland, they have their own stories. Sweden and Norway, they have stories of Nissa and Tomty, and so yeah, basically all over there's loads of different stories, and you can really tell that Heather did a lot of research into this, which I love. That for me is the most important thing, I think, if you're going to write fantasy books that have a real strong tie to folklore, is that you make sure that you read around the topic. I think that's super important, and it's maybe something that I was struggling more with books like Cackle, where I was a bit like, I don't know, there's a lot of things that just aren't quite right here, because I think things can still be really magical and whimsical, even if they hold tighter to the folklore and the actual traditions, as opposed to kind of far-fetched, like crazy theories. But if you love books about magic, fae, folklore, adventures, then you will absolutely love this book. And I believe it's going to be a series, so book 2 is set to come out at some point. I'm actually going to check that, and I can't wait for book 2. I'm so excited. But yeah, I really recommend picking this book up. I think it was on a lot of the lists for like the most anticipated fantasy reads of 2023, and it should be on that list because it's great. Okay, so this isn't coming out until January 2024, so we've got like whole year to wait for it, but I'm guessing it'll be worth the wait if it's anything like book one. So yeah, I really recommend picking this one up. Like I said, my favourite one on the list so far. So the last book that I picked up is actually one that I started maybe around the same time as I started A Billion Years, but it's taken me a lot longer to read because I was kind of trying to digest it in chunks. And that was Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake. And so this is a book that you might not see on everybody's reading list potentially. It's something that I'm particularly interested in. This is a book about mushrooms, fungi, lichen, mycelium, all the good stuff. And so I picked this up because I was particularly interested to read up more on this. It's cool. It's a cool book. I would say if you don't know anything about mushrooms or fungi, this probably isn't the book for you. You can definitely tell, obviously, that he is an expert researcher and investigator of fungi and mushrooms and mycelium. But obviously this isn't necessarily a light topic. I really enjoy researching it, learning about it, but I would say there was times in this book that I was also just like, I don't really know what's going on, which is why I took a bit longer to read it, because I was kind of trying to digest it in chunks. And sometimes I would need to kind of research around a topic, and when I got to kind of the end of a chapter, just because I needed more information, because sometimes I just didn't know exactly what he was referring to in the book. Basically, the book talks a lot about how everything is intertwined, and how plants and fungi communicate, how that impacts us as people, like as we consume plants, animals consuming plants, how fungi is super resilient and was around before us and will outlive us, and how it can actually play a part in helping us to save the planet. And so it's important stuff, important topic. It's a bit like bees. These are all things we need to know about and hone in on and be interested in, because the more people are interested in these topics, the more funding people can get, and the more funding they get, you know, the more that they can investigate how it can actually help the world, and they can do more tests and experiments, and obviously all of those things can make a massive difference in the long run. This is actually another one that I picked up on Audible. I often read a lot of non-fiction on Audible, and I actually was listening to it while I was walking through the forest, which was really nice because I felt like I could really absorb what was going on whilst also being in an area that actually mirrors the content that I was listening to. It was nice to kind of felt like I was doing field work. I was just out there looking whilst listening to the information. But yeah, I would say if this isn't an area that you're interested in, it's maybe not for you. I learned so much. I have like a brain full of like crazy fungi facts now, which is always fun to bring up, you know, if I'm in conversation with somebody about certain things, or if I'm just exploring the forest with somebody, or just anywhere, I can be like, let me tell you about fungi. But yeah, I will say it is on the heavier side. I would say if you've not read about, listened to, or watched anything on this topic before, it's probably not the best place to start. I would definitely start with something like, I know there's a lot of documentaries on Netflix at the moment about mushrooms and fungi. Start somewhere like that, or there's a great TED talk by mycologist Paul Stamets. But yeah, you know, it was enjoyable non-read. I would say, obviously, you know, whether or not this is a topic that you're going to enjoy. And yeah, I'll definitely be picking more books up around this topic because I find it really fascinating. That's all my thoughts on that particular book. I don't really know what else I can say without kind of going into detail. And that was the last book, right? That was the last book on my list. That's everything that I've read recently. I will show you what I'm going to be reading next. I'm going to be reading Axio's book, The Girl Who Fell Beneath the Sea. Can we just talk about like how pretty this cover is though? So magical. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this one. Obviously in a bit of a magical fantasy mood, which that's just a mood. That's just my mood full time. But and if you enjoyed this video, let me know, give me a thumbs up, and then I can always make these going forward as well based off what I've read each month. And so yeah, that is everything from me today. Thank you for sticking around, and I will see you in another video.